This is going to be a subject that I think all of us are very interested in. One that concerns me a little bit from time to time is that it can sometimes be thought of as a localized issue, but it's really not. Algal blooms are things that are not only occurring in Lake Erie, we're seeing them in the Saginaw River and Bay watershed, the Fox River and Green Bay watershed, but we are now seeing localized harmful algal blooms in other parts of the Great Lakes where we really haven't seen them before, Lake Superior, for example. So it's something that we all need to be concerned about no matter where we live, and to help us walk us through what's going on with respect to nutrients and non-point runoff, I'd like to welcome Susan Humphrey, Associate Regional Director General of Environment and Climate Change Canada, and Tinka Hyde, the current Division Director, Region 5 Water Division of the U.S. EPA, soon to be at the Great Lakes National Program Office of EPA, to the stage. Sue and Tinka will focus on the newly established phosphorus reduction targets. I think many of you have heard about these for Lake Erie. Action plans under development to meet those new targets, and priorities for future science and action. This is the first of two presentations this morning. Just like yesterday, if you have questions, we're going to ask that you hold them until the Q&A session that will take place after the second presentation at 10:55. So with that, Sue and Tinka.
So good morning, everyone. Today we're here to talk about phosphorus and algae. Pardon me. So what do these two things have to do with one another? Well, it turns out that phosphorus is one of the primary factors limiting phosphorus growth in the Great Lakes. In the right quantities, both phosphorus and algae are essential to healthy ecosystems. However, too much phosphorus results in too much algae, as you can see in this slide and these images of Lake Erie, and that is definitely not good for the ecosystem. I'm Susan Humphrey with Environment and Climate Change Canada in Toronto. My colleague and my friend, Tinka Hyde, is with the United States Environmental Protection Agency in Chicago. Tinka and I have the pleasure of co-leading a committee of experts who have done an enormous amount of work over the past 3 years to tackle the issue of excess algae in Lake Erie under the banner of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. We are very fortunate to be supported in our role by two of our staff, Sandra George and Santina Wortman. Each of the organizations you see on this slide has been heavily involved in the effort to date, and most of them are present in the room this morning. But as you will learn from us today, there is still a tremendous amount of work to do to reduce phosphorus loads and excess algae production in Lake Erie. Governments cannot achieve these objectives without the engagement of many others. So our presentation this morning is a pitch to encourage you to become part of the solution if you are not already engaged. During today's session, we're going to explain why excess algae is a significant issue in Lake Erie. We'll tell you about commitments under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement to work in collaboration with others to address the algae issues in the lake. We'll provide an overview of the scientific rigor that resulted in the establishment of Lake Erie phosphorus loading reduction targets earlier this year. We'll talk about some of the actions to reduce phosphorus loads to the lake that are already underway, and then we'll let you know what the proposed priorities are for the next 3 years, including the development of the Lake Erie domestic action plans. So let's get started. Excess algae growth is a challenge in many places in the Great Lakes, in fact, in many lakes around the world. The primary focus for our attention today is Lake Erie, because it's currently having the most significant algae problems in the Great Lakes. As you heard in the earlier session at this forum on the State of the Great Lakes assessment of the nutrients indicator, Lake Erie is considered in poor condition and deteriorating, as shown here by the red arrow facing left. In the next few slides, we're going to discuss the factors contributing to the algae issues here. So why is Lake Erie so impacted by nutrients and algae? Well, for starters, Lake Erie is the shallowest and southernmost, making it the warmest and most biologically productive of all the Great Lakes. On this profile, Lake Erie is highlighted with the red arrow. The lake is only 210 feet deep at its deepest point. Because it is so shallow and much smaller by volume, it tends to be highly sensitive to changes in nutrient levels and changes in the food web. The lake also experiences the most intensive land use when compared to other Great Lakes, as you can see on this slide. The drainage area, which includes Lake St. Clair along the Huron-Erie corridor, is home to 13.5 million people in the United States and Canada. The United States portion is about 2 times the size of Canada's. Lake Erie provides drinking water for a large percentage of the population, many areas of significant ecological interest, and a thriving sports and commercial fishery. The intensive land use in the basin, both urban and agriculture, puts significant stress on the ecosystem. For example, Lake Erie receives up to 8 billion gallons per day of treated sewage, and 60 to 80% of the land is used for agriculture. Increasing precipitation, especially in the spring, is increasing the runoff from these lands. So it's not surprising then, when we examine the input of nutrients in the Great Lakes, that Lake Erie stands out as having very high phosphorus loads. Phosphorus is an essential nutrient and found in many things, including in human and animal waste and in fertilizers. It is also the primary limiting nutrient controlling algae growth in the Great Lakes. Phosphorus is essential to life, but too much is a concern. On this slide, the height of the bars represents the size of the phosphorus load. Lake Erie receives the highest phosphorus loads of all the Great Lakes, the largest loads coming in from a few key tributaries, as shown here: the Maumee and the Sandusky rivers in Ohio, and the Detroit River, which is shared by the 2 countries, and the Grand River in Ontario. Now let's take a closer look at Lake Erie to understand how it responds to all this phosphorus. Lake Erie has 3 basins, each very different from the other. They are almost like 3 separate lakes. The differences are visible in the cross-section profiled on this slide. The Western Basin is very shallow and warm. The water column mixes from the top to the bottom. It is very productive. Most of the water that enters the lake does so through the Western Basin. Water moves through this basin very quickly. In a matter of days, it flows into the Central Basin, which is deeper and less productive. From there, the water moves through the Eastern Basin and eventually flows into Lake Ontario. The Eastern Basin is much deeper and colder, and productivity is low. On average, water is replaced in Lake Erie every 2.7 years. In Lake Superior, it's 173 years by comparison, and in Lake Ontario, 6. This is important since it makes Lake Erie very responsive to management actions. These features also dictate how Lake Erie responds to excess phosphorus. Each basin in the lake has its own response to excess phosphorus. The Western Basin and Lake St. Clair, including the nearshore areas, experience cyanobacteria, or more commonly called harmful algae blooms. The blooms can produce toxins that are very potent and can be a significant concern from a fish, wildlife, and human health perspective if they are present in high enough concentrations. In the Central Basin, it's primarily hypoxia, which is a technical word for low to no oxygen conditions in the bottom waters. Although we do see cyanobacteria blooms from time to time. In the Eastern Basin, it's Cladophora, an algae that grows on hard substrates and breaks off from time to time, fouling the beaches and the shorelines. This is especially a problem in the Canadian shoreline of the Eastern Basin. Next, we'll talk about these three issues in a bit more detail. Harmful algae blooms are a proliferation of floating microscopic algae, or cyanobacteria, that can harm human and animal health and the environment. These usually occur in shallow embayments in the Western Basin, such as Maumee Bay, Sandusky Bay, and where the Thames River enters Lake St. Clair. You can see the blooms on the satellite images shown in the top right picture on this slide. As mentioned in the previous slide, some species of cyanobacteria can produce potent toxins. The most common algae toxin in Lake Erie is microcystin, as shown in the middle image. This is the worst of the bunch and can be very toxic to humans and animals. Even non-toxic HABs, though, have negative impacts on other aquatic organisms and food webs. It's no wonder that drinking water managers in the United States and Canada are very concerned about the presence of these toxins in raw water and are very diligent about keeping these substances out of our drinking water supply. Unfortunately, occasionally this is not possible, as we saw in August of 2014 when the toxins caused the shutdown of the drinking water plants in Toledo, Ohio, and on Pelee Island, Ontario, affecting around 500,000 people. As we mentioned earlier, the Central Basin is deeper than the Western Basin, which allows the waters to stratify, resulting in the warmer surface waters being isolated from the colder bottom waters most of the summer. This is the basin where we see very low oxygen conditions in the bottom layer of water in the late summer months, famously called Lake Erie's dead zone. You can see this layer in the top right image on the slide. This is a natural phenomenon in the lake that is increasing in area due to algae blooms and climate change. These bottom waters move around and at times come very close to the shore, trapping fish, which then die. The fish kill captured in the bottom right image on this slide was the result of an event like this that happened on the Canadian shores of Lake Erie. Water quality at drinking water intakes is also affected in the Central Basin because these hypoxic waters contain high level of metals that require additional treatment at the drinking water plants. Lastly, but definitely not least, the low oxygen conditions encourage the release of phosphorus from sediments, which adds to the lake loadings. In bad years, these can be significant. We will not eliminate these issues in the Central Basin, but instead are hoping to return conditions to those that occurred naturally. The Eastern Basin is very deep and the water is much cooler. The concern in the Eastern Basin is what we call nuisance benthic algae, filamentous algae that grows along the lake bottom in the areas near the shore. The most prominent species is Cladophora. Eventually it sloughs off and it washes onto the shore. The decomposing material piles up on beaches and is unsightly, creates odor problems, provides breeding sites for biting flies, and incubates microbes such as E. coli, and the bacterium responsible for botulism, which is a concern from a wildlife and a human health perspective. So harmful algae blooms and Cladophora were issues during the eutrophication era in the 1970s that led to the implementation of the 1972 Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Early actions in Canada and the United States to reduce phosphorus levels in the lakes included reduced phosphorus concentrations in laundry detergents and improved treatment of municipal wastewater effluents. Through the 1980s, water quality improved and algae episodes were reduced. However, conditions started to deteriorate again in the mid to late 1990s. More recently, attention has focused more on addressing stormwater management and agricultural non-point sources of nutrients, particularly as they impact the nearshore waters of the lakes. Algae and cyanobacteria blooms in Lake Erie have been increasing since late 1990s and have significant impacts on the environment, human health, and the economy. We have talked a bit about the ecological and human health issues associated with the algae and hypoxia issues in the lake, but we don't want to leave out the economic perspective. The Great Lakes economy is the 5th largest economy in the world, and Lake Erie is an important contributor to that. Its waters support many recreational, commercial, industrial, and municipal uses, many of which are negatively impacted by the presence of harmful and nuisance algae and/or periodic episodes of low to no oxygen. Our goal is that Lake Erie continue to provide these services to local communities so that these communities thrive and people come to the shores of Lake Erie for the many wonderful opportunities it provides. The algae problem today is very complex. Factors causing the resurgence in algae growth include changes in land use and land management, increased frequency and intensity of storms, increasing water temperatures, the influence of invasive species on nutrient cycling, and changes in the forms of phosphorus, to name a few. Of the various factors, it is the amount of phosphorus entering the lake that can be controlled. However, controlling phosphorus is much easier said than done. Part of the challenge is the management approaches used in the past to reduce phosphorus discharges from sewage treatment plants, and urban, rural, and agricultural runoff may no longer be sufficient or effective in all cases. As mentioned, part of the challenge is our changing climate. Rainfall, especially spring rain, is linked to phosphorus loads, which in turn are used to predict the severity of the harmful algae blooms in the western basin of Lake Erie. On this slide, you can see from the graph that 2011 was a wet year, resulting in a huge bloom in the western basin. On a scale of 1 to 10, on the severity scale, 2011 was the most severe, or a 10, until it was surpassed by the 2015 bloom. In 2012, drought conditions were associated with a much smaller bloom. This is important because while we obviously cannot control the weather, it tells us that efforts to manage phosphorus on the land and prevent it from entering waterways that ultimately reach Lake Erie must be effective at minimizing phosphorus losses during storm events. The goal is that with appropriate phosphorus management in place, the loads will get smaller for the same rainfall, which will result in reduced blooms.
Thanks, Sue. Morning. So as if the issues highlighted in the previous slide are not complicated enough, managing nutrients in Lake Erie is further complicated by the fact that the waters are shared between Canada and the U.S. Fortunately, though, we have the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement to help guide us. This agreement commits the U.S. and Canada to address many of the issues affecting the waters of the Great Lakes, including excess nutrients. In the 2012 Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, Canada and the U.S. committed to review and revise nutrient objectives for all of the Great Lakes, starting with Lake Erie. As we mentioned, Lake Erie is a lake that is most urgently in need of action to reduce the impacts of excessive phosphorus inputs. The agreement lays out an approach, beginning with establishing objectives and determining how the reductions will be allocated by country. Each country is then to develop a domestic action plan which identifies the required on-the-ground phosphorus reduction actions to meet our targets, as well as the monitoring, research, modeling activities that will allow us to track progress and respond to any future changes in the aquatic ecosystem or on the land. Let's be clear. Healthy algal communities are a good thing. They are the foundation of the food web, and many organisms depend on these tiny plants for food. The problem we have is that many of the Great Lakes have too much of this algae in the wrong form. The pictures at the top of the slide reflect a healthy Lake Erie. The bottom images, not so much. The agreement clarifies for us the conditions we are trying to achieve in Lake Erie and the other Great Lakes. To paraphrase, we are looking to manage phosphorus inputs so that we have a healthy algal communities in terms of both abundance and species. By achieving this, we will reduce the presence of algal toxins to the levels that are no longer a concern to human health, fish, and wildlife. We reduce impacts to fish and wildlife habitats and the food web. Reduce or eliminate areas that are experiencing low oxygen conditions due to the overabundance of algae, and enhance people's enjoyment of the Great Lakes. As we mentioned earlier, the agreement directs us to start our nutrient reduction work in Lake Erie, complete our targets by target setting by February of 2016, and have our phosphorus reduction plans, otherwise known as the domestic action plans, in place by February of 2018. We are happy to report that we have met our first milestone, and phosphorus load reduction targets were adopted by Canada and the U.S. in February of 2016, this year. Currently, we are working with our partners to get the domestic action plans in place by 2018 or sooner, if at all possible. One of the questions we are often asked is, why did we focus on phosphorus when we know that there are other nutrients that contribute to algal growth? Well, it turns out that the science says phosphorus is the nutrient that normally limits algae in freshwater systems. So we limited the amount of phosphorus. We hope we will limit the amount of algae. It's true, though, that there are other important nutrients, such as nitrogen, that have a role to play. However, scientific consensus on that role is still in play. And so we will continue to keep our eye on the science as it pertains to other nutrients, and make adjustments as necessary to manage these issues into the future. Just to provide some assurance that we didn't just pick these targets out of the air, our Canadian and U.S. nutrients team established a group of 25 subject matter experts. The graphs and figures on this slide represent some of the information that was developed by the team and used to establish the targets. These experts, using the best available science and modeling, evaluated the conditions of the lake, determined that we need to focus on phosphorus to control the algae and the related hypoxia concerns in the Central Basin, selected indicators and benchmarks that move us toward healthier algal communities, and then through a rather rigorous modeling exercise, recommended phosphorus and load reduction targets to our U.S. and Canadian nutrients team. In addition, in the U.S. side, we convened an independent science advisory board to review our progress and the conclusions we made. The science advisory board, while it has not finalized its report, but the latest draft indicates that they support our recommendations, and we look forward to further conversations with them on this topic. For more details on our targets, you can go to binational.net. The U.S. and Canada consulted with the public on the recommended targets during the summer of 2015, prior to adopting these new targets. Comments were received online and through face-to-face engagement sessions. There was strong public support for the targets, and we're continuing to engage with stakeholders in the development of our action plans. Targets were adopted in February of this year with the explicit recognition that targets have yet to be developed for the Eastern Basin. As I just mentioned, Canada and the U.S. have officially adopted our phosphorus reduction targets for Lake Erie this year, and the new targets can be summarized as follows. To minimize harmful algal blooms in the Western Basin and in the nearshore areas where harmful algal blooms occur, spring phosphorus loads from the Maumee River and nearshore tributaries must be reduced by 40%. By spring, we mean March to July, which is a critical time when excess phosphorus feeds the bloom. The Maumee River in the U.S. is one of 8 nearshore priority tribs and the primary contributor to the Western Basin bloom. To address hypoxia, the total annual load of phosphorus to the Central Basin must be reduced by 40%. In order to achieve this, total phosphorus loads have to be reduced by over 3,500 metric tons from the area draining into the Central Basin, which includes the Western Basin and the Detroit River Huron-Erie corridor. The load reduction was allocated between our two countries. In Canada, they need to reduce about 200 metric tons, and in the US side, we have to reduce by 3,300 metric tons. At this time, there are no targets for the Eastern Basin, but these Western and Central Basin targets are expected to result in reduced growth of Cladophora as well. Here, you can see the locations of the 8 tributaries that are associated with the Western Basin and nearshore cyanobacteria blooms. 2 of these are in Canada, and the remaining are in the US. This is what we expect the Western Basin bloom to look like if the 40% target for the Maumee River is met. The bloom won't be eliminated completely, but will be drastically reduced. In most years, we expect the bloom to be much smaller, to look like the bloom that occurred in 2012, which is pictured on the top right. We would still expect more significant blooms occasionally, about one in every 10 years. For example, a year like 2011 would look more like 2008, which is on the bottom right. We want to emphasize that much of the work is already underway to accelerate phosphorus reduction efforts, particularly in the Western Basin. Some of these are shown on the slide. In fact, the US and Canadian governments are spending millions of dollars each year to tackle this problem. For example, on the US side, the Detroit River Wastewater Treatment Plant, one of the largest in the US, has significantly reduced their phosphorus discharge as a result of upgrading their system. In Ohio, legislation was passed recently which restricts the application of manure and fertilizer on saturated, frozen, snow-covered ground. And as part of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, more than $60 million were invested in Lake Erie Basin from 2010 through 2015 to reduce nutrient pollution and to support related science and monitoring work. In Canada, their Great Lakes Nutrient Initiative is a 4-year, $16 million effort focused on improving our understanding of algal issues in Lake Erie and phosphorus loading from the Canadian tributaries. In addition, Canada Ontario's Great Lakes Agricultural Stewardship Initiative looks to demonstrate effective best management practices and approaches in controlling phosphorus runoff from farms. The images in this slide show the sources of phosphorus vary by basin and by watershed within a basin. As we said before, it's complicated. We are undertaking further work to identify high phosphorus contributing areas and the major sources within these areas. This information will be used to direct priority on-the-ground work. As we proceed with the development of the plans, here's what we have discovered. Reductions from all sectors are required, both urban and agricultural areas. We need to adopt a multi-barrier approach, also called a systems approach, to significantly reduce phosphorus losses. This means we have to not only look at source reductions, applying less fertilizer, for example, but also at ways to prevent phosphorus that is applied to the land from washing into the waterways. As shown in the image on the right, this applies to both urban and agricultural non-point sources because it will be key to manage this runoff. We also need to prioritize specific practices and geographies. Enhanced awareness, outreach, and tech transfer is going to be essential to our collective success, and costs are highly variable depending on the mix of actions that we choose. It's critical that we apply a science-based adaptive management approach to manage excess phosphorus inputs. This will require active management on an ongoing basis. Adaptive management provides us with a rigorous process by which we regularly review the effectiveness of our activities by monitoring, evaluating, and updating our targets and adjusting management activities to achieve our ultimate goal of a healthy and resilient Lake Erie. Here you can see the US EPA and Environment and Climate Change Canada's ship, the Lake Guardian, and the Limnos. These ships provide a platform for much of the science that is undertaken on the lakes. Because science provides the foundation upon which our management actions are built, over the next 3 years, we are aiming to improve that foundation. For Lake Erie, we will develop and implement monitoring and modeling approaches, which will be used to track and report our progress towards achieving the phosphorus reduction targets. To address algae problems in Lake Ontario, Huron, and Michigan, we will conduct research, monitoring, and modeling activities to support future nutrient reduction activities. Given what you have heard today, we hope you have a good, sound understanding of the scale and complexity of the problem. It's not going to be solved overnight. Government cannot do this alone. Everyone has a role to play in helping to achieve these objectives. As stated earlier, a lot of the work is already underway, and over the next 3 years, we will be engaging a wide range of stakeholders, First Nations, Métis, and tribes, in the development and implementation of our domestic action plans to reduce the excessive phosphorus loads into the lake, as well as establishing phosphorus load reduction targets for the eastern basin of Lake Erie in order to close that gap as well. A final reminder. Each country is in the process of developing its domestic action plan, looking to engage partners in the development and implementation of these plans. So please, get engaged. If you're not already part of that process, please talk to Sue and I, and we'll be able to point you in the right direction. So thank you.